Hi, today we're going to be going to the TSA 2016 question, do people vote in line with their personal economic interests? With these aims in mind and using our standard structure, which you can get a refresher on just by pausing the video, let's jump into it. In this question, what sort of terms do you think we're going to need to define? There actually aren't that many, so I think we might need to talk about what personal economic interests we're going to be talking about, and I think basically we might consider things like income, inflation, employment, tax and benefits, so that's fiscal sort of policies, public services, that completes fiscal policies. We might want to talk about those sorts of things. And then we might want to say what we mean by economics. So economics is the study of resource allocation in a system, so economic interests are interests to do with resource allocations in systems. So we might, though, ask ourselves, well, what isn't a resource? See if you can come up with a satisfactory answer to that. Because we might ask ourselves, well, isn't happiness a resource? And if it is, then do we vote in line with what makes us happy? That seems a wider question and maybe a different one, but why isn't happiness a resource if we don't want to say it is? These are all questions you might think about touching on in your introduction and then working out a definition for so that there's no ambiguity. To start with, we might note that this is empirical. This is an empirical question. So what does that mean? It means it's asking us about a fact about the world. So is it the case that people vote in line with their personal economic interests? In order to answer this satisfactorily, we need evidence. Now, we probably don't have any data on voting patterns. If you have this at your fingertips, then you'll be one of very few. Basically, I think we can be working on the assumption that no one has detailed knowledge about voting patterns, although if you do, that's great and you can bring that in. But we're perfectly okay to use hypothetical examples and reasoning to explain our points, and then evidence and examples of real-world things wherever we can. Using our point, explain with example, link back to question, and evaluate with counter-example structure, our point structure, will help us to keep our answers empirical, especially as long as we keep our example and our counter-example and counter-argument remembered. However, it's also a question that asks for a yes or no answer. So try and come up on each side with some reasons why you might argue that way, using our PESLM structure to help you. I came up with these. On the yes side, I said, well, few actively vote against their economic interests. I came up with the fact that classes often vote together, so people of different classes vote in similar ways, and we might infer a causal link from that. We might consider the idea that people tend to follow their parents' votes, and parents and children tend to have fairly similar economic interests. And I came up with the idea that it's pretty sensible to vote with interests. We generally, in social science, assume that people are pretty rational, so they'll do the sensible thing. So we can assume that people vote with their economic interests. On the other side, however, I came up with the fact that people have imperfect information, so can't always make the best decisions, won't always make the sensible decisions. They might not know what their economic interests even are, because economics is really complicated. It might be meaningless to speak of the idea of best. It might be meaningless when we're talking about economic interests. What is a best interest? What does it mean? We might have many different sorts of interest, so a best economic interest, which is what's implied by their economic interests, might be meaningless. Some people don't vote, and that's a more important thing than you might initially think, and social issues matter, and so do moral issues. I'm sure you can think of social and moral issues that you care about and would factor into your choosing of a government. Finally, we don't have to come down either fully on yes or fully on no. We'll focus on a couple of points on each side, but we'll then answer with, to some extent, or often but not always, or some but not all. This question doesn't ask for an absolute conclusion. We can do a relative one or a proportional one, and that might be useful. Let's look at a couple of points on the side that says, yes, they do vote in line with their personal economic interests. The first one of these might be an observation that classes tend to vote together. So why? Well, people in a class tend to vote for similar parties. You could give an example. People who tend to identify as working class tend to vote for Labour in the United Kingdom, for example. People in a class tend to have similar economic interests. People who identify as working class tend to have lower than average economic income, for example. So you could call that similar economic interests. This is an oversimplification, and you'd want to add more nuance, but this is a skeleton of a point. We might ask, so what? Well, if people with similar economic interests, because they're in the same class, vote for similar parties because they're in the same class, we might infer, make a judgment on what is the best explanation, and we might say that there's a causal relationship between economic interests and voting for a similar party. So we might say that people do in fact vote for their economic interests, or in line with their economic interests. Can you think of a counter-argument to this? Well, all we've done is change the unit from person, people, to classes. So it's possible that classes may vote against their economic interests. All we've done is shifted the question, you might argue. As a secondary point, we might consider that it's sensible to vote with interests, and we might assume the voters are rational. So why would this be relevant? Well, voters would benefit from voting for their economic interests. That's what it being in their economic interests means. They economically benefit from it. So, in social science, we often assume a model called Homo economicus. What does this mean? It means voters are rational. What does rational mean? It means they act consistently. So, we assume that voters will do what's sensible, and because we assume that what is sensible, or rational, is to vote for economic interests, voters vote for economic interests. Can you think of a counter-argument to this? As it turns out, there are a few. One I've written down is that assumptions are okay for instrumental models. So things like Homo economicus are okay when we're assuming them in a model. And at that, a model that is meant to describe a fact about the world. It describes a fact about the world, so it predicts, for example, how much someone is likely to spend. It's a predictor, not a describer, sorry, I meant to say. It's a predictor. If it gives us a good prediction, it doesn't matter what assumptions we use. No one really thinks people are rational. But it doesn't matter what assumptions we use as long as it gives us a good prediction. This, what we're trying to work out, is a descriptive model to answer an empirical question. A descriptive model about what people are really like. So making an assumption about what people are really like is just assuming your conclusions and isn't a good step. Another bad step is to say it would be rational to vote for economic interests. Ceteris paribus, or assuming everything else is equal, it would be rational to vote for economic interests. But in fact, a trade-off exists between economic interests and social and moral issues that you might care about. So we can't make this assumption. We oughtn't make this assumption. I think this argument falls down, someone might argue. Now to the other side. On this side, we might argue, well, people are ignorant of what their economic interests actually are. Why do you think people are ignorant of economic interests, if you're arguing for this point? Well, you could say, not everyone knows what they want, or what they need, or what is good for them. So, inflation is good for the indebted, because, for example, the value of the pound decreases, so there are more pounds sloshing around, so people who owe, say, £100 to someone else actually owe much less in terms of value, therefore the value of their debt goes down. So it's good for the indebted. However, it's still unpopular even with that group, we can imagine. Therefore, not everyone knows what's good for them. So what? Well, because not everyone knows what's good for them, people don't recognise their interests. And because they don't recognise their interests, it's hard to vote for their interests. It's basically nearly impossible to consistently vote in line with your interests if you don't know what your interests are. If you did, it would just be fluke. Fluke is very unlikely, therefore people don't often vote in, or people don't always vote in line with their economic interests. Can you think of a counter-argument to this? Well, one might be, in large part, people actually do recognise their economic interests. This is a premise difference, so you need to justify it. So you'll say, well, basically, intuitions exist. I know that if my pay is going down or my tax is going up, then I know that's bad for me. So I don't need a detailed understanding of exactly why. I can intuit it. I know that it is bad without necessarily knowing why. So that could be a counter-argument. Let's note that some people don't vote as our second point. Why? Well, we'll start with an empirical observation. We don't get 100% voter turnout at elections, so clearly some people aren't voting. So some people don't vote at all. So it seems silly to say that they vote in line with their economic interests if they don't vote at all. They're unable to signal preferences, their economic preferences, or the preferences they have about their economic interests if they don't vote. So they don't vote at all, and they don't vote in line with their economic interests, obviously because they don't vote at all. So what? Well, they're unable to affect policy to boost their economic interests, they're not voting in line with their economic interests, so we have to answer this question. No, that seems, or at least not always. This seems like a fairly killer point. However, as a counter-argument, we might include their decision not to vote as an economic interest. Maybe time is an economic interest, and it's not worth their time to vote. If they live, for example, in a safe seat where their vote won't affect it either way, where there are similar parties so their vote won't matter because the same policies will be enacted, therefore it might not be worth their time to vote. Maybe choosing not to vote is actually a form of voting in their economic interests. You can argue either side as long as you argue it as well as you can. I hope that's been helpful.